Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Is this working? Okay, this is working. As Ian mentioned, I work at the Foundation for Freedom Online. We're a non-profit and a watchdog that keeps track of all of the nefarious forces and organizations that are trying to restrict the range of acceptable viewpoints on online, of which there are many. And about 2 weeks ago, there was a major development in this area when an organization called the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, or GARM, shut down following a lawsuit from Elon Musk, X, and Rumble, the video platform. It was also being investigated by the House Judiciary Committee, and it was also being investigated by us, the Foundation for Freedom Online. In particular, we were looking at the government contracts that their members held. Now, what was GARM? So GARM, the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, sounds like a good idea, right? We all want responsible media, and we don't want irresponsible media. Sounds great. So it was a cartel organization created by the advertising industry, specifically the World Federation of Advertisers, which represents around 90% of all advertising spending worldwide. So it's essentially the entire industry. And they created GARM, which was made up of, all of the big global advertising agencies and, lots of major brands, with the sole purpose of establishing what they called a brand safety floor for social media and online media sites. So the whole purpose of GARM was to tell social media companies and tell media platforms and websites what was and wasn't acceptable from the perspective of the entire advertising industry. And they were set up in 2019, and one of their major actions was boycotting Twitter as soon as Elon Musk took over in response to pressure from NGOs. And their shutdown was a really big moment because for about probably over 10 years now, the advertising industry has really had online free speech in a kind of chokehold. So whenever there's a activist organization or a media company that's in favor of censoring some form of online speech, when they don't get what they want from the tech platform or the media company in question, when they don't respond to their demands to censor content, what would happen, and this happened, consistently over the last 10 years, those activists, pressure groups, or those journalists would then go to advertisers and say, look at this controversial content that's on this news platform, that's on this social media platform, you should pull your ads. And, over the last 10 years, the advertising industry, has dutifully complied with this, pulling their ads en masse from YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, from news sites like Fox News, Breitbart, anything that pro-censorship activists dislike, the advertising industry would generally comply and put pressure on those platforms in a bid to, make disfavored forms of online speech unprofitable. Because so much of online companies and platforms have been wholly dependent on ad revenue, especially at the start of the 2010s. There's been a move towards subscription revenue a little bit, but ad revenue is still very, very important, which is why the advertising industry has all of this power to pressure and influence online platforms, and they've used that to restrict what can and can't be said on platforms like X and Facebook and YouTube and all the major ones. And, this happened again and again over the last decade. And the shutdown and, the creation of the Global Alliance for Responsible Media in 2019 was an effort to formalize that. It was the entire advertising industry coming together and saying, here are our guidelines for content. If you don't meet these guidelines, if you have too much, hate speech or disinformation and all these other categories on your platform or on your website, then, we're going to advise all the brands we represent not to advertise with you. That was essentially the subtext of what GARM was doing. So their shutdown, which happened 2 days after Elon Musk X and Rumble filed a lawsuit against them, happened a month after the House Judiciary Committee released the results of investigation into them, and I think 8 days after we published a report on their members' government contracts, GARM announced it was shutting down. And I think this was a big moment because, like I said, for the last 10 years, we've seen this trend towards advertising industry-led censorship of the internet and online free speech, and this was the first time the advertising industry was kind of appeared like it was on the defensive, that it was actually undergoing some sort of consequence for the activities it had engaged in. Now, if you're all smart people, so you probably don't get your news from the mainstream media, but if you did, you'd probably be reading some stories about this that were along the lines of, Elon Musk is trying to force companies to advertise where they don't want to advertise. And that kind of misrepresents the lawsuit and what was at issue with GARM. The lawsuit wasn't about, one or two advertisers deciding they didn't want to advertise on X or on Rumble. It was an antitrust lawsuit filed on the basis that this was an organization that represented 90% of the global advertising industry, by their own admission. So, it's one thing for one or two companies to say, well, we don't want to advertise here or there. It's another thing for the entire industry to come together and collaborate and collude and say, we're all going to pull our adverts all at once. That's the sort of thing that antitrust law is there for. So, don't believe any headlines from Gizmodo or other places saying Elon Musk wants to force advertisers to advertise on his platform. That's really not what was happening. There's an interesting question here, I think, that deserves to be examined, which is, why did the advertising industry become this massive force for the restriction of free speech in the last 10 years? Of course, representatives of the advertising industry will say, well, we just want to keep our brand safe. You can say what you want, you can allow what you want on your platforms, but we're under no obligation to advertise there, and our brands are under no obligation to advertise there. So the way they would present it, and this was their argument before the House Judiciary Committee when they testified there about a month ago. Their argument is that there's this kind of inescapable market logic going on where, the advertising industry can't possibly support the full range of political viewpoints online, and they can't possibly advertise on platforms that allow the full range of First Amendment protected speech, because that would somehow cause this extraordinary damage to the brands they represent. So that's their argument. They're saying they're not biased in any way. They're not politically biased. There's just this purely neutral commercial reason that they've behaved in this way for the past 10 years. That's an interesting question for people who work in tech, especially because the question is the ad revenue model inevitably going to lead to censorship? Or, on the other hand, is it simply a problem with the people who run the advertising industry right now? Are they actually getting the brand safety thing completely wrong? And is ad revenue actually fine? It's just the people who are in charge of ad revenue right now who are the problem. And I actually lean towards the latter viewpoint because it all comes down to what I call the brand safety lie. This is their excuse for pulling advertising revenue from various platforms. They'll say it's going to cause this terrible damage to our brands if we're forced to advertise on Twitter or on Fox News or with Joe Rogan. Let's run through some of the platforms that and media companies that have suffered advertiser boycotts in the last 10 years. So Twitter, that's a platform that has about 100 million American users at the higher estimates. That's American consumers who have massive spending power. If you're looking at it purely from the perspective of, advertisers want a big market of people who will buy their products, you'd probably want to be on a platform that has 100 million American users on it. Spotify. So in the emails obtained by the Judiciary Committee, you see members of GARM going to Spotify in 2021 and saying, hey, Joe Rogan just had this guy on his podcast who was questioning official COVID policies. This is a brand safety problem. And And interestingly, they weren't even advertising on Joe Rogan's podcast specifically. They were just upset at Spotify for hosting it. And of course, there are also news sites. So there was mass advertiser pullouts from Fox News, mass advertiser pullouts from Breitbart News. A lot of conservative media outlets suffered a massive loss in advertising revenue. And, Fox News, they have, I think, usually 9 out of 10 or 10 of the 10 top-rated cable news programs. So they have a huge audience. You see the advertising industry getting upset at Joe Rogan, who's been the number one podcast host in America for, more than the past 5 years. The only other podcaster who comes close is Tucker Carlson, who went past Joe Rogan about a month ago. Then Joe Rogan came back this month, but they sort of exchanged that top spot in podcasting audiences. But Tucker Carlson is also someone who suffered advertiser boycotts. So this is pretty interesting because advertising is two things, right? It's getting your product or your brand in front of a large audience, but it's also making sure that audience doesn't develop a negative perception of your brand in the process. So what the advertising industry is saying is that advertising, even though the audience on Twitter is huge, even though the audience on Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson are huge audiences, Fox News has a huge audiences, they're saying that the risk to their brands is so great that we're going to voluntarily give up these huge audiences of millions of people in the name of brand safety, because the brand safety risk is just so huge we can't possibly advertise there no matter how big the audience is. And I don't think that argument holds up to scrutiny at all, because there's never been any evidence that a widespread consumer backlash would happen against a brand because their ads showed up on Twitter or because their ads showed up on Fox News. Some of you might be familiar with Rotten Tomatoes, the movie review site. So Rotten Tomatoes takes the reviews of movie critics, it takes the reviews of the audience, and it puts them together in these aggregate scores. And you often see examples where critics will rate a movie way higher than what the audience will rate the movie. And I think the advertising industry is kind of doing a similar thing, because whenever journalists or activist organizations are upset that an ad is appearing in a certain place, they'll treat that as a massive risk to brand safety, even though there's not necessarily a consumer response. The response from journalists is enough to do it. Whereas when there's the few examples we've seen of consumers actually engaging in a mass backlash against a brand haven't been over things like ads appearing on Twitter or ads appearing on conservative news channels. It's been over things like the Dylan Mulvaney Bud Light ad, which cost Bud Light about $1 billion in lost sales and had hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people saying, well, we're never going to buy Bud Light again. That's the last thing you want as a brand. That's a real risk to brand safety, right? And then you had, Gillette's ad about toxic masculinity in 2019 that led to a massive consumer backlash against Gillette. And that was also estimated to have cost the Gillette brand, millions of dollars in lost sales. So those are the two big consumer backlashes against brands that I remember from the past 10 years. The only backlash that's occurred because brands have been on free speech platforms or have been on, alternative media sites has come from journalists and activist organizations who don't necessarily represent the consumer. But the advertising industry has consistently claimed that there is a brand safety risk, even though there's no evidence that consumers actually care that their ads are appearing in these places. So that's why I'd say it's not necessarily the case that the ad revenue model will lead to online censorship. I think it's the people who are in charge of ad revenue and who advise big brands on where to advertise right now who are the problem. And if you look at the emails that have come out of GARM due to the discovery process in Jim Jordan's investigation, you can see advertising executives literally saying things like, well, we really hate Breitbart and really hate the Daily Wire, so we were keeping a special close watch on them to see if they if they violated our brand safety principles, and then we pulled ads from them. So, along those lines. So they're looking for any excuse to claim to the brands they represent that these websites that they really dislike violate their brand safety principles. It just needs to. They just need an excuse. They're looking for an excuse, even if there's no real evidence that a consumer backlash is on the way. If they have their excuse, they can take it to the brands and they can say, pull your ads from this website. So I think that's what's going on. The way to think about brand safety in the advertising industry is similar to trust and safety in the tech industry. So trust and safety was developed by tech companies to keep the users of tech platforms from clicking on malware or being redirected to sites that have, spam or phishing or other unsafe material. But over time, trust and safety took on a new meaning, which is we're going to protect the users of social media platforms from misinformation, from hate speech, and from all these other categories and excuses that are used to shut down political viewpoints online. Brand safety has become the same thing, right? So brand safety started as, this very objective idea, if you have a company that sells kids' toys, you don't want your ads appearing on porn sites, basic common sense stuff like that. What it seems to mean today is brand safety means you can't have your ads appearing next to these political viewpoints that I don't like. That's certainly how the advertising industry has appears to have been treating it over the past 10 years. And the shutdown of GARM, I think, is the first time that's really been exposed as to what's actually going on. So that's the rundown on what happened. That's my theory on the advertising industry and censorship. If anyone has any questions. Yeah, it's become harder for them to collude, and I think that's important because they really have, when they're doing these mass boycotts, they really have to act together as an entire industry, because if 5 out of 6 advertising agencies boycotted X, then the last one, the 6th advertising agency, would be able to get ads on X at a really great deal. It would actually be in their interests to go and take those ads. So that's why they have to do it all at once. So they actually do need to be able to collude, but I think their shutdown shows they recognize there's actually a real antitrust risk for them there when they act together as an industry. Yeah, that's right. And the big YouTube boycott in 2017, I think, was the first really organized ad boycott that really cost a tech company, in this case YouTube, I think hundreds of millions of dollars by some estimates. And the playbook has always been sort of the same. It doesn't really start with advertisers or brands. It starts with journalists getting upset about something. So back in 2017. The big headlines, when they were just sort of testing this tactic out, the big headlines were, the ads of these major brands are appearing next to extremist videos on YouTube. And they did find some genuinely extremist videos. But then they went on to say, but also hate speech and then disinformation after that. So it was really just the thin end of the wedge to censor viewpoints they don't like. And they were using genuinely extremist videos to establish the playbook. But once again, even though this was on the front page of the Times in the UK, a massive newspaper, on the front page of other newspapers around the world, there was no real sign that consumers were going to stop buying cars from Honda because the Honda ad appeared next to even an extremist video on YouTube. I don't think that would upset the average consumer enough, because the average consumer understands that's kind of unintentional. You can't check where each and every ad goes. So they weren't paying GARM directly. They were paying GARM's leading members, though. And, that's sort of interchangeable, because GARM was very much led by the big global advertising agencies. There were about 6 of them. A lot of the advertising industry is concentrated around these big global holding groups. And the U.S. government, you can actually read the report on our website, foundationforfreedomonline.com. The U.S. taxpayer is bankrolling them with quite a lot of money. We're talking billions of dollars of government contracts going to advertising agencies like WPP, the Publicis Group, Omnicom, and their subsidiaries for things like military recruitment ads and public service announcement and things like that. I think one of them has a $4 billion contract from the Army, which is huge. It's a 10-year contract. And interestingly, that's the same contract that produced that Army recruitment ad, the animated one a few years ago, The Calling, which you might remember it was widely derided for being overly woke and overly ideological. Another case of the industry's own ideological biases being way more of a threat to brand safety than their ads appearing on Twitter. I think that's decreasing. I think the global advertising agencies, their business model, they're very old companies. Their business model was made at a time long before the internet, long before you could track whether someone has made a purchase through an ad. And a lot of them use very weird old school methods, like charging clients billable hours for their advertising account. They're also very bloated. They have tens of thousands of employees. I'd say they have a couple of advantages. Quite a few of the advertising agencies will also own the big data brokers, and that's obviously a very profitable industry and a growing industry from the ad industry's perspective. And because they're so big and they have all these high-level corporate relationships, they can also get better deals from, say, Google or Facebook when they're purchasing ads, because they also have bigger clients. But other than that, I think there's a lot of reasons why I think that industry might see a decline, mainly because of their business model being adapted to the pre-digital age. Well, I'll be releasing a lot more content on this over the next few months. You can follow me on Twitter at Allum Bokhari. You can follow the Foundation for Freedom online, where we release our in-depth reports on this topic and other topics related to online censorship, at FFO_freedom, or on our website, foundationforfreedomonline.com. You can also follow our founder, Mike Benz, on Twitter. But yeah, we'll be examining this topic comprehensively over the next few weeks and months. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give a totally confident answer to that question. From what I've seen, individuals were being sued as well as GARM itself, so I think the lawsuit might continue on that basis. Obviously, X could also choose to drop the lawsuit, and Rumble could choose to do the same thing. We'll see if that happens. I don't think they can avoid discovery. I think there's precedent where you can't avoid discovery just by shutting down. So that'll be important to see. Like I said, the emails that Jim Jordan was already able to obtain from GARM and its members through subpoena are also very illuminating. You can go to the Judiciary Committee website and see that. Just search for Judiciary Committee GARM, and you'll find the report with all the emails. So my guess is discovery will continue and the lawsuits will continue, but I'm not 100% on that. Yeah, well, I think probably the safest model to guarantee free speech is still going to be subscription revenue. That has its own drawbacks, which is if you paywall your content, it's going to be much less viral. But a lot of people do a mix of things where they'll have premium content and non-premium content, which is available to everyone. I think the advertising industry censorship over the past decade has been driven less by objective market forces, like a real brand safety threat, and more by the ideological biases of the industry. I think the industry listens far too much to journalists and media companies and activist organizations, because I think they probably reinforce the advertising executives' own biases when they're making these decisions about brand safety. And again, you see in the emails, advertising executive looking for a brand safety excuse to demonetize the sites they don't like. So that's the reverse of how they would be thinking about it if they were objective. They'd be thinking about it in terms of, the brand safety risk has to be really bad before we pull ads and lose all of that attention to our brands. Instead, they're saying, okay, we're going to look for the tiniest excuse to demonetize the websites that we don't like. That's why I think over the past 10 years, the problem has been less the model and more the people in charge of the industry. But, as far as the model goes, like brands will always have a different sort of viewpoint. Like depending on the brand, they'll have like a different level of risk tolerance. And there'll always be some speech that brands don't necessarily want to be associated with. But this idea that there's a brand safety risk in advertising on Spotify because Joe Rogan's on there, advertising on the top 2 podcasters in America, advertising on an entire social media platform with hundreds of millions of users, that's somehow that the brand safety risk is so severe that you can't have that huge audience, that's nonsense. I think that's just the industry's biases driving that. Yeah, I think the simple explanation is there just hasn't been pushback until now. There hasn't been investigation of the ad industry until now. So I think brands and shareholders and all these stakeholders were just accepting, these guys are the experts. They know what brand safety is. When actually they were exploiting that perception of their own expertise to just go after places they didn't like. Not that I've seen, like, not someone directly saying that, but it's sort of like, you have a law against jaywalking, but we're only going to watch one guy in town 24/7 because he's the guy we don't like, and everyone else can get away with jaywalking. It's just like the fact that they were focusing so much on these few sites that they disliked, sort of it tells the other side of the story as well. I mean, this, like I said, they were created by the World Federation of Advertisers, which is 90% of all, claims to represent 90% of all ad spending worldwide. So I would imagine they were on every platform. They were certainly on Twitter and Spotify. So that specific email, they were talking about news websites. They were talking about Breitbart, the Daily Wire, and one other that I can't remember. There were other emails where they talk about Spotify and X. No, the government contracts weren't part of the lawsuit. At the foundation, we just thought American taxpayers would want to know where their taxpayer money is going, because I think American taxpayers, by and large, support free speech and support online free speech. And this, yeah, you're right. The government doesn't have to refuse to do business with companies that are restricting viewpoints online. They can absolutely do that if they want, well, or maybe not. I mean, there are some lawsuits that claim the opposite. But at the end of the day, American taxpayers are going to support these very pro-censorship companies, which I think is an important information to get out there. By 3 companies, I assume you mean like YouTube, Facebook, and or are you talking about the advertising agency? Google and Facebook. Right. That's an interesting question, because I think it really depends on, like, if you had a decentralized environment, it would depend on the companies and whether they had ways to fall back, other revenue sources like subscriptions. Certainly that's what Twitter's been trying to do. They've been trying to introduce subscription revenue to offset the losses in advertising revenue. You could make a case that in a decentralized environment, it would be easier for big advertising agencies to bully smaller companies than it is for them to bully Facebook or Twitter. But at the same time, you'd also have so many companies that, some of them would be happy to say no to the advertisers. Some of them would have a bigger share of subscription revenue versus advertising revenue, so there'd be less concern by advertisers. And certainly like startups in the past decade, right? So Substack was a small startup not too long ago, and they decided right at the start, we're not going to do any advertising revenue, we're going to just do subscriptions. And obviously the advertising industry can't pressure them at all, because the advertising industry has no leverage. So more startups experimenting with with different forms of revenue model probably does weaken the advertising industry's influence.